The following program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org. New York was his birthplace. From Green Beret to aide to Bobby Kennedy, he rose to one of the nation's most successful publishers with Black Enterprise magazine. A pioneering entrepreneur, a faithful family man, and a leading voice for social change. Earl Graves epitomizes the strength of the American dream. The History Makers is proud to present An Evening with Earl Graves, with host, civil rights activist, and civic leader, Julian Bond.
Good evening. Earl Graves and I met in the crucible of tremendous change. America was in turmoil. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. Robert Kennedy called a meeting of black leaders in Atlanta the day before the funeral was to be held. That was at that meeting that I first met Earl Graves. We'd meet again at the funeral of Robert Kennedy. It was in that moment where one examines and explores oneself that the idea of Black Enterprise magazine was born. So it was in 1969, 1 year after Kennedy's death, that he'd asked Charles Evers, Shirley Chisholm, John Lewis, Andrew Brimmer, William Hudgens, Henry Parks Jr., and Edward Brooke, and me to serve on his advisory board and to help open the doors to corporate America.
Oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Church in the high hall, rocking Jerusalem. Ringing them bells, church in the high hall, rocking Jerusalem, ringing them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Oh, Mary, oh, Martha, oh, Mary, ring them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Jerusalem, 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 oh, ringing them bells. Rocking Jerusalem, ringing them bells. Rocking Jerusalem. Ringing them bells.
Tonight, audience, you and I are going to go together down memory lane. Is that right? And it's going to start right now. Earl, we've known each other, it's hard to believe, for 38 years. You were Bobby Kennedy's right hand on his staff. I was in the Georgia State Senate. We met at Martin Luther King's funeral. A meeting was called to Black leadership the day before the funeral. What are your memories of the time and the place when that occurred?
First of all, the people who were there, Eartha Kitt, not a civil rights leader in the first instance, Andy Young, John Lewis, Perry Belafonte, and many others that you would expect, Jose Williams, who was very much involved in the civil rights movement. And we were kind of at a loss what we were going to do. Martin wasn't here. There was rioting already going on all over the country. And we sat there and we talked, and at least we agreed that we had to try to do something to stem whatever the violence was. And how were we going to do that? We left that meeting with a sense that we had to carry on for Martin. He would have wanted it that way. I think that both Julian and John Lewis spoke to that in a very eloquent way that night. And 2 months to the day that we had that meeting with Robert Kennedy asking to have the meeting, Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
Now, you were traveling with him at that time on his staff. He's running for president, winning the California primary that night. What do you remember about that night?
Well, first of all, I remember the tragedy of the thing of being outside of the hotel because we were going back over, Barbara and I, to see where our sons were. They were across the street at the Beverly Wilshire.
Yeah.
And
Earl, you can look at me while you're talking.
okay, oh, all right, good.
They can see it on the big screen.
Okay. I've been trying hard for 40 years to get along with you. You don't make it easy. In any event, this tragedy happened with Kennedy, and I heard about it because some staff member came out and said he thought that he had heard some shots inside. And I told him to take my wife and go back across to the hotel across the street, and I would check it out. And just about that time, some policemen jumped out of police cars. And I remember them saying when John Kennedy was assassinated that the policemen slugged anybody who was nearby. So they said, where are we going? I happened to know where the basement was. And I said, I know where it is. And all the way down the stairs, I remember saying to these policemen, remember, I worked for Senator Kennedy. Remember, I worked for Senator Kennedy, not knowing what I'd see. As we got to the bottom of the stairs, to the right was a door that had been swung open, and Rosie Greer already had Sirhan with his arm broken on the table, on a steam table. And as we pushed the door open, right in front of me was Robert Kennedy lying on the floor with his life ebbing away. It was a seminal moment in my life in terms of the tragedy of the thing. And to lose two leaders like that close together, it was a matter now, what am I going to do?
And at that time, you had already come further along than your family might have expected, that you might have expected. Let's take a look.
It was 1935, and the country was in the depths of the Great Depression.
Most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work.
In New York's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, Earl Graves was born the eldest son of Earl Godwin Graves and Winifred Colette Seeley Graves. His father, a strict disciplinarian, worked for Overland Garment Company in New York City's garment district. He also sold women's dresses wholesale out of the family's living room on weekends. His mother, small in frame but strong in spirit, kept the family together. Once, when her son was forbidden to use the pool at the Brooklyn Central YMCA, Mrs. Graves took the issue into her own hands. Shortly thereafter, the pool was integrated. The Graves family attended St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Brooklyn, and everyone in the Graves household was expected to earn good grades and mind their manners. Earl would begin his first job selling Christmas cards for his Uncle John, but it would be Uncle Joe, a pharmacist, who would be his mentor. An athlete, Graves was one of 20 black students out of 7,500 at his father's alma mater, Erasmus Hall High School in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. Graves commuted 2 hours per day to attend school. He also worked part-time at the Brooklyn Public Library, where he met a man named Sam Young. Young saw potential in young Earl and encouraged him to attend the historically black university, Morgan State. Earl visited Morgan and immediately fell in love with the campus and campus life and wanted to attend college there. It was Uncle Joe's encouragement and Earl's odd jobs and small business ventures that would make this possible. Doing so would change the course of Earl Graves' life.
Now, Earl, tell us, what was it like growing up in Bedford-Stuyvesant then? I think all of us have some image of New York City if we've never been there or seen it, but what about Brooklyn? What about your childhood?
There was family. I mean, there was a sense of village. If you did something wrong, Mrs. Williams, who lived about 2 doors down from me, kind of policed the block from the 3rd floor. And if I did something wrong, she would see it, not mention anything to me other than call me. And as my father was coming home from work very tired, about 6 o'clock, she would whisper down to him, the boy did something wrong.
And you were the boy.
And my father was not a reasonable person, so, I clearly remember that if you would eat, that meant that he would say, come with me, and I'd walk down the street like it was the death march. And my friends would walk with me, and they'd have conversations. What do you think he'll hit him with? I don't know, belt, what do you knowing full well that the next night it could very well be them. but he tried to be a loving parent, my dad, but he was an orphan by the time he was 16 years old. And raising his younger brother, my Uncle Joe, who became the pharmacist. And so there were times when I wished that he and I had been closer. He was proud of the things that I did. He didn't want me to go away to Morgan. He thought that was frivolous, that why do you have to go away and live and pay for rent? Although I was going to pay the rent, that why you want to live on a campus, you don't have to do that. You ought to really be at home, and you can study and do what you need to do. I think in a way I really wanted to get away. And I went away the first year with about $617 saved and had a bunch of odd jobs, as you've seen. And there's several guys in this room that I probably still owe some money to for flowers they paid too much money for.
What about your mother? And what about your brothers and sisters?
Well, we were close. My mother was tough. That YMCA thing that you talk about, I came home and I said, Mom, there's a problem. I had been able to go and swim in this Y just once. I was part of the colored YMCA. It was Carlton Avenue Y. They took us over to swim in this pool, which to me looked like an ocean compared to the pool we were swimming at the Carlton Y. So I came out and I said, what do you have to, I said to the guy, and I was maybe 10 years old, what do you have to do to swim here? He said, you just have to remember the Y. I said, well, that's great. So the next day, instead of going back to the Carlton Y, I went right back to this Brooklyn Y, the main Y. And I finished swimming. The lifeguard said to me, the guy that runs the place would like to see you. And I said, well, fine. I got dressed and came upstairs, and he said, young man, you know, we have a Y for your people, you boys. And I knew right away because my mother had armed me to get ready for any kind of nonsense. And he said, we expect you to swim at that Y, and this Y is for our people, the white boys. And I said to myself, my mother's not going to like this. So I said, yes, sir. And he said, so you won't come back? I said, no, sir. And I said to myself, I'll be back. And I went home and told my mother. And it was too late that evening, fortunately for him, to not go back. Next morning, my mother was up and told my sisters and my sister, two sisters, my brother, she would be back. And she told one of the tenants upstairs to listen out for her. She put her hat on, and when my mother pulled her hat down on her head, that meant the bad things were going to happen. Yeah. And then she put on her white gloves. Pocketbook on her arm. The guy was going to be in trouble. And the Y got integrated that afternoon.
All right. Now, before you're even thinking about Morgan State College, you went to Erasmus Hall High School, which is your father's alma mater. How'd that come about?
My father decided he wanted me to go to the same high school that he did, and contrary to what people think, New York was very segregated in terms of how the schools were set up. You were parceled off, if you will. Maybe that's crude, but to certain schools, we had about 4 schools that we could pick from, and my father said, I want you to go to Erasmus, and I said, well, you know, Dad, that's not in the district. He said, well, I'm going to talk to somebody. And even back then, politics being politics, although he talked to his boss, and the guy knew someone at the high school, and they said, well, if he can study Greek, he can go to the high school. My father said he will study Greek. Got there, I got to tell you, I never spent a day studying Greek, but I had great 3.5 years at that school.
What was the racial composition when you went there?
There were 7,500 students. 7,400 were white. And it was, if they ever said we're going to have a race riot, it would have been bad because there only were 20 Negroes then. And so out of the 7,400 students, that's what the ratio was.
Well, you get out of high school, and you've already said your father didn't want you to go away to Morgan, but your Uncle Joe financed your education.
Well, no, that would be overstatement. I told him I was going to borrow about $300 a year from him, never intended to pay it back, but and he said, fine. And so when I think the tuition is about $618 a year for out-of-state students. I mean, keep in mind that library they talked about before I was getting paid 57 cents an hour. Uncle Joe helped me, and I didn't ask him the first time. The first time I left, I had about enough money to cover going to Morgan for its first year. The second time, I was working during the summer. I had 2 or 3 jobs. I waited tables. I was a lifeguard. I was a waiter. And so I had saved money, and I knew something about mentoring. When I was 19 years old, a junior at Morgan, walking down Lewis Avenue, Bedford-Stuyvesant. I saw a friend of mine coming towards me, Walter Lee, who I knew we used to play hide and seek around the corner. And I said to Walter, Walter, how are things going? He said, well, I just got out of the Air Force. And I said, wow, what are you doing? And he said, I'm back at Wise. And Wise was a shoe shine parlor. So I said, you mean you shine the shoes? He said, well, yeah, I'm trying to decide what I want to do. And I said, well, didn't they give you a GI Bill? He said, yeah. I said, well, why don't you go to college? He said, well, where would I go? So I said, why don't you go to Morgan? And he said, well, how will I do that? I said, look, I'm going back in a couple of days, and you can ride the bus with me. And he said, no. He said, we'll take my father's car. He won't know. And, and so we got in the car, went down to Morgan, and Walter Lee was enrolled within 2 weeks. We ended up calling him the Roach, because he never had a room the entire 4 years he was in school.
Really? No.
Well, let me just finish this point. I know I'm off the track. But the point is, I want to say that you can mentor, because in this audience tonight is Dr. Walter Lee, surgeon dentist. Where's Walter Lee?
Right.
Right there.
Now, while you're at Morgan, you joined the ROTC to help pay for college, but you also were creative in coming up with different ways of making money. What did you do?
First of all, I wanted to go to the Penn Relays, and I was the slowest guy on Morgan's track team ever. And I defy anyone to say differently. And so I wanted to go to Penn Relays, and I was walking down the street, and I said, wow, I wonder who cuts all the grass for these people. I'd already had a flower business. I was responsible for all the flowers that came on the campus. And my deal with the florist was, anybody who comes into your store from Morgan and buying flowers, I get 10%. And he said, well, how will I know they're from Morgan? I said, do you know of any white students going to Morgan? So that was fairly simple, a dumb question, but simple. Yeah. And so I looked, and here was this opportunity. All of these lawns looked like they needed cutting, so I took a piece of paper, made up a mimeograph form, put the phone number, the dean's office on the piece of paper, and figured maybe I'd get a half a dozen phone calls, and it went up and down each door, putting these flyers in about 100 doors of the houses. And this happened on a Saturday, so Monday I'm in class, and a person comes into the class that I was in and hands the teacher a note, and the teacher shakes his or her head. And at the end of the class, he said to me, Mr. Graves, would you see me for a moment? So I said, absolutely. And I said, what is he? He said, the dean wants to see you. So I said, I didn't actually remember the flyers. So I got back, and his secretary was there, and she said, wow, he is really looking for you. So I go in, and the dean says, what is this? He said, when did I become your secretary? So without thinking about it, I looked down and I looked at all that work, and I said, wow, Dean, I could use you to help me work, right? So tonight is a seminal moment in my life, because who can imagine that they will grow up to have an audience of your friends and peers who will come together to allow you to tell your grandchildren what your life has been like, and to tell them and remind them of how wonderful their grandmother is. We've been married 46 years. She is the matriarch of... I'm not in charge tonight, but I was asking her to stand up. You see how influential I was. But in any event, will you wave? You'll wave at least, right? There you go. All right. That's considered winning in my family. She's our moral compass. She's our intellectual compass. And when my sons, when I tell my sons we're going to do something, they say, have you run that past Mom yet? I said, I'm in charge. They said, I know, but run it past Mom anyway. So, I mean, imagine being able to do this tonight, and that my grandchildren will tell their children, and they will tell their children. And I expect that to happen.
Now, some people don't know that you were once in the real estate business, and I'm guessing this stemmed from a lecture you heard from Professor Spaulding.
Right. You must have some crib notes, do you?
Oh, yes.
I wanted to know what I was going to do when I got out of the service. I wanted to have something planned, and so I went to this lecture, and the guy started talking about real estate. Now, back then in Baltimore, you really had three options. There were no recruiters on campus at any colleges, much less African-American schools. That was on IBM and PepsiCo and Philip Morris. That was 25 years away before that was going to happen. So you had a choice. You could either work for the government, coming out of Morgan, I was in the Social Security Administration right there in Baltimore. You could teach school, which was something else you could do. Or you could, because of the ROTC, you could go on active duty. Well, at that time, I pretty much was sure I wasn't going to want to stay in because I knew that I wanted to make money, and I wasn't going to make the kind of money being in the service I wanted, but I knew I had an obligation, and I felt that obligation, and I thought that it would be good training, which it was. And so went into the Army, came out, and the first thing I did was call a real estate. Got the yellow pages, just flipped to there was a real estate office by my house. Called and said that I had a very experienced real estate salesman that I wanted to come over, and could I send him over? And he said, well, how soon can you send him over? And I said, I'm going to call him for you, and I'll let you know. All right? And so I hung up the phone, called back, and said, hi. My friend just told me you're interested in talking to me. He said, yeah, can you come over? I said, I'll be right there. And literally, you have to do these things sometime. And literally got the job as a salesman. And in the first 3 months, now by that time, Barbara and I had met.
How'd you meet her?
On a blind date. I was with Walter Fulcher, who, a fraternity brother who was also in the Army. He was here with me, and he said, look, there's a lady that is a friend of another friend. And I said, well, this may be her lucky day, you know, one of those kind of things. One of the, you know, I mean, you have to understand, Walter and I had, you know, we had shiny boots, and I mean, I jumped out of airplanes, and I was making $260 a month. You couldn't tell me anything. And so we had this date, and we met, and she was very attractive, very bright, and not impressed at all by my, you know, Army outfit on. And also, you and I are leg people, right? She had big legs. Right? You and me, right?
There you go. All right. So you meet on the blind date. She's not impressed with you. But now you've been married 46 years. How'd that happen?
Well, I gave her my phone number, and you know, 'cause I mean, that was.
You gave her your phone number.
Exactly. This is becoming painful, but let's keep going.
All right.
I gave her my phone number, and she said, what is this? I said, that's my number at the post. If you call the first sergeant to get a hold of me. She said, I don't call guys. So then I said, should I tell her about the fraternity or who I am? And you know, none of that mattered. And so 3 weeks went by, and I never got this phone call. So I called her, and I said, did you lose the number? She said, no, I told you I don't call guys. And I said, look, I better have another date with you because you're obviously confused.
Where'd you go on your second date?
See, Julian's asking about the second date, and this is totally not necessary, Julian, because he knows the deal. But in any event, I got to her house. By this time, I had on my civilian clothes, and I had a 1955 Buick with about 57 cents worth of gas in it. And so I said to her, what would you like to do? Praying that she would not say the movies, because, you know, $240 a month, $270 a month, it was going to be tough. And she said, well, I'll do whatever you want to do. So I said, well, how would you like to go out to the airport? And she said, I would love that. I said, whoa, right. So, you know, I said, this is it. You know, and so I'm humming to myself as I'm driving to the airport, and I get to where I would usually park. And
Earl, your boys are loving this.
In any event, I parked the car, and she said, what is this? So I said, what do you mean? She said, how can I see the airplanes from here? So I said, when I could get my breath, I said, let me understand it. You really came out here to see airplanes? I told you we did not need to discuss the second date.
Well, that's okay. So now real estate and politics come into your life. Let's take a look.
In 1960, Graves left full-time military service and joined the National Guard, becoming part of the 19th Special Forces Group, the Green Berets. A civilian job with Ajax Realty led Graves to hone his sales skills and build some assets for his young family. But Graves would have his eyes on politics. Times were changing, and he wanted to be a part of the change.
Yes, as I gaze upon this great historic assembly, this unprecedented gathering of young people, I cannot help thinking that 100 years from now, the historians will be calling this not the Beat generation, but the generation of integration.
His efforts to join the local Democratic Party were rebuffed, but his organizing efforts would catch the attention of Bobby Kennedy during the Johnson-Humphrey presidential campaign. Shortly after, Graves was offered a job on Bobby Kennedy's staff. The hours were long and exhausting, but Graves relied on his military skills and work ethic. Kennedy's mantra was, "The unbelievable takes a day, impossible takes a week." With Earl by his side, the senator started a redevelopment project in Graves' own Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. For the first time, Graves saw the elite part of American society.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
But it all took a tragic turn when Bobby Kennedy was killed. Graves had a wife and 3 young sons and was suddenly out of work. He and the other Kennedy staffers would be given Ford Foundation grants. Graves took his grant and headed toward his ancestors' home of Barbados, where he found blacks in power, but lacking economic resources to make change. Graves' idea for a newsletter would become the model for Black Enterprise magazine, and in 1970, after taking out a $175,000 SBA loan, Black Enterprise magazine was born. That same year, Essence magazine was started. The Minority Enterprise Small Business Corps began. Henry Parks became the first African-American CEO to take his company public, and George Johnson's Johnson Products Company stock became the first African-American company to be traded on the American Stock Exchange. Blacks were starting to enter corporate America in record numbers, and Graves assembled an advisory board composed of community leaders to open up the doors to corporate America. He would present to ad executives who would turn a deaf ear, but he continued selling, and slowly but surely, doors to corporate America began to open, and Black Enterprise magazine and its readership grew significantly. Earl G. Graves Limited had essentially tapped an untapped market.
You go to Barbados, you get this Ford Foundation grant, you go to Barbados, and I know that's your ancestral home, your family home, but why'd you do that?
I wanted to see with a country that was run by people, the natives of that country, what the economic impact of that was. And I got there and was greatly disappointed because they weren't in charge of the businesses. They were in charge of the government. But when it came to who owned the bank was owned by Barclays Bank, and who owned the department store downtown was a white Bajan, and who owned the largest supermarket chain was another white Bajan. And so it was disheartening to me because I had in my mind that I was going to go there and see that the highways were being built by Bajans, and that was not in fact the case. Now that's not an indictment of just Barbados. The same thing is true of any place you would go in the Caribbean, and for that matter, in many instances even today.
Yeah. So the seeds of the idea of these people running everything but the business, was that a little seed in your mind that became the newsletter, and the newsletter again became the magazine?
It was, because I clearly thought that we could do better back in the States. The Barry Rands of the world were coming along, the Wayman Smiths were coming along. Wayman went from being a lawyer to becoming a corporate executive. You had to go out and get a job and work in the Senate. I don't say that facetiously, but the civil rights, that wasn't a great paying job.
No, it didn't pay well.
No. So there was opportunity. And so the idea of the magazine came along, but it was a single entity and stayed a single entity for quite some time.
What role did the advisors play? How did I help?
One of the most difficult things was then 36 years ago and is today to get in the door to be able to tell your story. And so when I started writing to these companies and saying, look, I have a magazine with upscale African Americans and people in the professions and people who are running businesses, one, I wouldn't even get an answer by the letters, and then I'd call up and ask, had the letter arrived, because I hadn't gotten a reply. And that was just it. There was no response. I mean, it wasn't moving the way it needed to. And so I said to Julian, I said to John Lewis, look, I'm going to write a different kind of letter. So I'd like to drop by to Hertz, for example. It was one of the places, if you remember, we went. Yes. I wrote them and said, I'd like to drop by and see you, and I'd like to bring two of my associates, Julian Bond, the civil rights leader, and John Lewis, who will be out of jail by that time. And we'd like to visit you to see what your thoughts are about doing business with African Americans. Well, what a change in attitude, you know. Now, I can't say that everybody rolled over and played dead, but Shirley Chisholm, if you can imagine Shirley Chisholm going on an advertising call with me. Senator Brooke was the complete diplomat, but when he came out of the room, they were slapping each other on the back, and it was still happening. Andrew Brimmer took no prisoners. I mean, he was absolutely incredible in terms of writing a letter and then expecting that company to respond. And he was already serving on a couple of the boards where we were trying to do business, which did make a difference. So to make Julian happy, the advisory board played a very, very important role.
Well, I remember this trip we took and talked to the CEO, not to the advertising people, because they hadn't responded to you. What was their attitude before?
They raised the question of whether or not we would bring the cars back. And
that's what I was looking for.
Okay, and so, but I don't know, it was just that racist. They said, you know, they envisioned that we were going to drop them all off in some disenfranchised neighborhood, and, you know, first the tires would go and then the car would go. So let us say it was a bit of a challenge in some instances.
But I remember you had assembled this tremendous list of a kind you could buy today, but it didn't exist then. Every black football player, every black basketball player, every black professional, every black doctor, every black dentist, every black CPA, down the list of all the professions. Was this helpful in convincing these people who didn't believe that this market existed?
Absolutely. What I had compiled was a list of the leading African-American professionals and business people in the country. I'd gone to the Urban League, and Whitney Young wanted to be very helpful. He told me where he thought the best list could be found. He didn't want to compromise the members of his organization by outright giving me the list, but he opened some doors for me in terms of getting there.
So many magazines start up and disappear and we never hear them again, but by the 10th issue, you're profitable. Now, how'd you do that when so many people fail?
Well, first of all, I made up my mind that we were going to have a quality product. We set certain guidelines for ourselves in terms of what we were going to do at the book, and we used the word book and magazine interchangeably. We set a value system that said if we couldn't do it right, we weren't going to do it at all. And I tried to do that with everything, not just with a magazine. And so we challenged the editorial people. You've got to get it right. And I didn't, quite frankly, I didn't know that 9 out of 10 magazines failed to begin with. So I kept right on plowing along. Pat Patterson was our initial editor. We have 2 outstanding editors now, Derek Dingle and Alfred Edmond, who are senior people who are here tonight. And they still carry on that same tradition, which is what allows us to be as good as we are. The thing that made the magazine what it is today is what it was Black Enterprise when we started is today a brand. When you say Black Enterprise, we're talking about the private equity company that we have in terms of how that interfaces. We're talking about the golf and tennis event that we have every year where anywhere 1,200, 1,500 people show up. We're talking about the Women of Power Conference. We're talking about these 2 television shows we have and what we're doing with those. And so Butch and Johnny and Michael have really taken this, and their co-workers have taken this thing to a new level. And as a matter of fact, I'm actually staying home at least 2 days a week now.
Now, I'm going to ask the question everyone in this room wants to ask. Why are you wearing those sideburns?
I thought you said you were going to keep this at a high level. There was a guy I met who was actually working for me for a time, and I said, wow. I looked at him one day, I said, those are terrific sideburns. I said, you can't even tell that you're bald. And he said, and he said to me, I'm not bald. I said, what are you talking about? Of course you're bald. I mean, his head looked like mine does now. And he said, I'm not. I said, you are. And he said to me, I'm not. And he actually believed, and people did because they were looking, he said, when people see these sideburns, Graves, they don't see my baldness, right? Mm-hmm. So, do I look bald?
Now, what was it in the 70s and the 80s that was crucial to the magazine's growth?
First of all, we were chronicling the growth of business, the BE 100s, which became one of the most important things we did. We started that in 1973. First list, and the first list, Barry Gordy did $40 million and was at the top of the list. Johnson Publishing was right behind him. Today, if you look at that same list, the #1 company, Castle Wall, does $1.4 billion, and there are 3 companies on the list that do $1 billion, and so you can have that kind of growth. Now, I say that in one breath, but that's no short journey for the people who have accomplished it, and so that has become a standard, and that's an important part of what
was it hard to put the first list together, that first 100 list together?
Well, if you ever asked a brother or sister to tell you what they made, then that will answer your question. Yeah. But the answer was yes. But and imagine calling John Johnson, and I said, John, I'm going to need to know what you did. He said, right, Graves. And he said, now, what you are going to hear next is a click, right? And John, over the years, we became fast friends. But all he wanted to know was, what did the other guys do? Mm-hmm. And he was always satisfied in the position he was in, and that was the position he earned. We never compromised at all. There were people who lost his friends, and I don't think they really were friends because they didn't make the list. They weren't going to talk to us again, or they were going to stop doing business with us. And so those weren't friends to begin with.
You know, you've already anticipated the next question, which is about the multimedia enterprise. Let's take a look at this multimedia enterprise.
Today, Black Enterprise boasts a readership of 4.1 million and annual revenues topping $60 million. It is at the epicenter of today's business community. With Black Enterprise magazine as the anchor, the BE brand has evolved from a single title publication into a multimedia company. The brand's growing list of properties include 2 television programs, Our World with Black Enterprise and The Black Enterprise Report, a nationally syndicated radio series, Black Enterprise Magazine's Keys to a Better Life, business and career development conferences for entrepreneurs and women, lifestyle events, an award-winning website, and an interactive digital edition of Black Enterprise. After 35 years at the helm of this multimedia conglomerate, Graves turned the reins of leadership over to his oldest son, Butch, in January 2006, adding CEO to his president title. With over 60 honorary degrees and numerous honors to his name, Earl Graves remains committed to making a difference both inside and outside the corporate boardroom. He supported the release of imprisoned South African leader Nelson Mandela, protested the murder of African immigrant Amadou Diallo by the New York City Police, and launched the Black Wealth Initiative to help African Americans create multi-generational wealth. Graves serves on several corporate boards and contributes to countless causes.
It gives me a great pride to announce a pledge of $1 million to my alma mater, Morgan State.
He has always been the voice of reason.
All you're trying to do is guarantee of opportunity. That's what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get an opportunity to level the playing field so you can do this, have the chance to do it the same as everyone else does.
While nurturing the careers of many, he is known as a true family man. He and his wife Barbara have been married for 46 years and enjoy spending time with their 8 grandchildren. With their 3 sons running the business, Graves remains as chairman and publisher. His legacy lives on. For Earl Graves, making a difference is what life is all about.
When you first started the magazine, I think you had 2 CEOs. 10 years ago, 2 CEOs. Today, you list more than 20. Look forward a bit. What's that number going to grow to?
The top is anywhere you want it to be, because the average shareholder just wants to know that you're driving the share price up. That's all they're interested in. Now, is there still racism out there? Absolutely.
But it can be overcome if you've got the goods.
Yes. obviously.
And obviously you had the goods. One of the goods that I think has been consistent through the magazine, both as a kind of hidden message and lately as an out front message, is wealth building. And you got this Black Wealth Initiative. Tell us about that.
Well, my editors came to me, Alfred Edmond and Derek Dingle, and said, we need to go in a direction that's going to lead what this country needs to do, that we've got to say to people that passing on your car payments when you die is not wealth sharing. That's not the answer. And so we need to do something different that's going to make a difference for people. And I said, well, what do you think we should do? He said, I think we need to talk about saving. We need to talk about home ownership. We need to talk about investing. And he said, and so therefore they came up with the Black Wealth Initiative, these 10 points. What is missing is that our parents taught us that we were supposed to save. And I worked for Western Union, making 75 cents an hour. I'd bring my envelope home unopened, give it to my father. He would give me what he thought I should get. Maybe it was $12 in the whole envelope for the week. And he would take a part that he would save for me, a part that he would, I quote, give to the house. And there was no argument. That was it. Now, and I must tell you, when I was working for him, I never just discussed the tips with him that I got, but that was, you know. But again, it was a discipline that he inculcated to us that is missing today. When Barbara and I have said to our sons growing up, we will help you if you have the right motives in terms of what you want. If they were to come to us and say, we need some assistance in buying a car, that's a very short conversation. But if they come to us and say, we want to improve something in our house, or we'd like some assistance, and I must say that most of it they have done themselves, but we want our sons and their friends and the daughters, and I must say the young women are doing an outstanding job. We need to touch on that before we close. In terms of the growth that you see that's happening in this country, and they are understanding what it is that our Black Wealth Initiative is saying. You've got to save, you've got to plan for the future. You know, your IRA is not going to do it without planning on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
Now, I'm sure many people in the audience want to know, you know, what the secret of your success is. We know it's hard work. We know you had an idea that no one else had had. But how did you become as successful as you have and still kept your family so closely around you? You know, you think about businesses, and minority, majority don't really care. Johnson Publishing is one that's done this, and Herman Russell has done it, and you've done it, passed on to the next generation, but so many don't. Why is that so, you think?
Well, first of all, again, a lot of credit has to be given to Barbara. We disagreed early on that we were going to spend the time with the kids irrespective of what I was doing. And so therefore, and you know, in Little League Baseball, that's like watching paint dry. But they were involved in sports, and I'd get home in time to the extent that I could, even when the magazine was in its embryonic stages, to see him play baseball, to see him play, or Johnny would do something, or Michael was doing something. So that happened.
How many of Butch's basketball games at Yale did you go to?
Butch and Johnny actually played against each other in college. Johnny was at Brown University and Butch was at Yale. And so I had a sweatshirt made where I bought a brown sweatshirt, cut it in half, and I bought a blue sweatshirt for Yale and cut that in half, had a housekeeper sew it together, and on one side it said Brown, on the other side it said Yale, and Barbara and I would sit right in the middle at half court, and no matter, we couldn't lose. No matter who won, we were. So we were very proud. And Michael was playing football. University of Pennsylvania as a nose tackle, and we'd go and see him, and Barbara always would say, as Michael went out on the field weighing 290 pounds, I hope my little boy doesn't get hurt, you know.
I think yesterday that Barbara has retired from the business 7 times.
Well, Barbara just said one day, she said, I think I'm going to retire. I said, you can't retire. And this was maybe, she worked at the company for 20 years, and this was, made an invaluable comment. When our CFO died, she became the CFO for 6 months, and things, you never knew there was a change. And so when she wanted to retire, I accepted that, but every time there was a crisis, we'd say, call Mom, and Barbara would come back, and so we brought her back innumerable times. We've cut that out now, because now I'm trying to stay home, and so that's working, but, and then we have an outstanding staff of people today. You know, people who work for us have to come to work dressed like the way you and I are every day. We don't run a democracy. You have to dress like you're ready for business. If you come as an intern, you can't come with cornrows, because you go walking with cornrows to a major corporation, they're not going to tell you they didn't hire you because you're cornrows. You're just not going to get called back again. Now, you can make your statement if you want to, but I think you should make a statement by supporting the NAACP or help tutor some poor kid who needs tutoring, rather than try to hire you what your hairstyle is when you get to the job, and then they don't hire you.
Now, mentioning interns gives me a nice segue to another question. You said earlier today that you always have interns at Black Enterprise Magazine, but you described the gender difference in the applications that you get. What was that?
We had 500 applications last year for internships. We hire about 10 to 12, Butch hires about 10 to 12 interns each year now. And this summer, and we had 500 applications, only 50 came from African-American men. All right. Now, but let me just say that's typical across the country, and it's an issue we clearly have to deal with. If you go in most African-American schools on the campus, in many instances, you will really think you're at a female college. At Howard University, we just graduated where 70% of the graduates were female. The incoming freshman class at Howard, where I've been a trustee for 20 years, again, had 69% of the students were female. At graduation, that number will be higher percentage-wise. So we have to ask ourselves, if the same students, female, are graduating from the same schools that the guys went to, assuming they finished, what is happening, and what is it that we're saying to the African-American young male is not allowing him to finish school and stay in school? And it's something we've just got to do something about. And it gets as basic as, and I've said this in a couple of speeches, that who's going to marry our daughters? You could, having a family and raising children is a very normal thing to want to do, and we've got to do something, not just to make it possible for African-American females to get married. Well, I'm talking about the basis of our society going forward. In many instances, when I look back on segregation, we had to do it for ourselves, and we were better off in segregation because we were doing it for ourselves, right? Now, having been in jail several times because of segregation, you may or may not agree with that, but...
No, I understand exactly what you're saying, that all of us lived together in one community. We weren't separated as much by class then as we were now. And we had an economy of our own, which is small and struggling, but nonetheless there, and lots of that has disappeared now. So I understand exactly what you mean, but what can we do about it now? Facing these present-day realities, what can we do?
We need to do more to get African Americans to give. We can't assume that we got there or feel satisfied with the fact that we're there, and therefore don't look around us to see those who are in need. And that's something we have to do. And it's something that we do and try to do in leading, and we have to teach our children to do just that, and I believe that strongly.
Imagine you could do it all over again, and you couldn't do what you're doing now. What would you have done instead?
If I had it to do over, I think I would go to law school. I think the law touches everything, and I would say to the young men and women in the audience, if you're not sure what you want to do, the law will give you a basis for many, many things. There are many people in this room who are lawyers who are not practicing the law, but the ability they've gotten from the education from the law has made a difference to them in business.
Now, you spent your career in New York City. If you did it all over again, what would you do differently?
I'd start in the South.
Why the South?
Well, first of all, the opportunity is great. There's a whole bunch of people in New York like all of us, and there's a bunch of people like us in Atlanta and other major cities, Philadelphia, Chicago. Not a great baseball team in Chicago, but there's still a lot of good people.
They were with you, Earl. They were with you.
I couldn't help myself, I'm sorry. But in those cities, the opportunities are there. There are people who are doing well in those cities. We know that Xerox in Connecticut has African Americans at the top level. We know that Lloyd Trotter is the vice chairman of General Electric. And so that's there. But in the South, and when I say the South, I'm not talking about Birmingham. I'm talking about going to some city in the South that's named after some Civil War general, Confederate, and that you can't pronounce. That's the city you want to go to. The land is cheaper there. The life slows down. I did well in New York, but to an extent, the big cities are not for the faint of heart. I mean, you've got to be prepared to deal with it every day. You got to go and prepared to fight every day. The racism of trying to convince people to still advertise till this day. Butch gets the same kind of letters I used to get, and Johnny gets it, and Michael gets it, and our staff gets them. We are just so good at what we do that we overcome that and keep on marching.
Mm-hmm. And here's one which I imagine will be difficult for you, not because you can't answer it, but because sometimes it's hard to be introspective and self-examining. What do you want your legacy to be?
I want my legacy to be that my family was most important. Mm-hmm. I try very hard for my grandchildren to know that I love them very, very much. I tell them that their reputation is the only thing that they have, and if they screw that up, there's no place to go, right? And I try to inculcate that to other youngsters also. None of us know how long we have down here on this earth, but I want Barbara to know I love her more and more each day in terms of the time we have left. And I'd like people to be able to say that I made a difference in terms of education, that I made a difference in terms of my extended family, who I love dearly. And again, I need to say that whatever legacy I have, I think Barbara has played an enormous role in backing me and being with me and alongside of me too.
Earl, this is a remarkable story, and I'm so happy you shared it with everyone here and with me, and we've been close for all these years. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for sharing this story with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Earl Graves.
Till he comes, sing to my Jesus. Oh, my Jesus, 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 till he comes. Oh, yeah, my Lord, oh, yeah, my Lord, oh, yeah, my Lord. Hallelujah. I'm gonna pray to my Jesus, oh, 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 my Jesus, till he comes. Pray to my Jesus, oh, 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 my Jesus. Can't you feel the Spirit move? Can't you feel it moving? Can't you feel it moving? Can't you feel it moving? I'm gonna shout, oh, my Jesus, 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 till he comes. I'm gonna shout, oh, my Jesus, 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 till he comes. Oh, Elijah, oh, Elijah, oh, Elijah, oh, Elijah, 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 oh, Elijah, Elijah, oh, Elijah, oh. Come on, sister, help me to pray. Tell me my Lord done pass his way. Elijah. Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, oh, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord.
Elijah Rock, shout, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah
Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord.
Satan ain't nothing but a
snake in the grass.
He's a conjurer.
He's a liar.
Hallelujah, Lord.
Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock, Elijah Rock,
Elijah Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord. Elijah Rock, shout, shout, Elijah Rock, coming out the Lord. If I could, I surely would stand on the rock.
For more information or to order your own copy of An Evening with Earl Graves, please visit thehistorymakers.org or call 866-914-1900. That's 866-914-1900. The preceding program was funded in part by Toyota, AT&T, Baldwin Richardson Foods, Lincoln Financial Group, Apple, American Airlines. A complete list is available at thehistorymakers.org.